At Christmas, my son kicked me out of the house without a penny. The words he threw at me were sharp and cold, tearing through the years of love I'd given him. My heart broke as he stood in the doorway, watching me leave. He didn't even care that it was Christmas. He didn't care that I had no place to go. I stood on the cold, empty street, the weight of his rejection sinking in. I wandered aimlessly, not knowing where to turn. After what felt like hours, I found myself sitting on a bench in front of a bank. The hustle of holiday shoppers passed by, but I felt like I was in another world, disconnected from everyone. I pulled out the old card my husband had left behind. The card was a relic, something I hadn't used in years. But now, it was all I had. I walked into the bank with my heart racing, hoping the card still worked. I didn't have much to live on, but maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to get by for a while. When I handed the card to the teller, her smile faded instantly. She looked at the screen, her face draining of color. "Madam, quick, look at this," she yelled, her voice trembling. I froze. The screen in front of me showed a large debt, a debt I couldn't possibly afford. My husband had always handled the finances. Why was this happening now? "Madam, this account has been flagged for fraudulent activity. You need to leave, now," she whispered urgently. I was speechless. The floor seemed to shift beneath my feet, and before I could process what was happening, I was escorted out by security. I stood on the street, lost and confused, the world spinning around me. I didn't know where to go or who to turn to. But then, as I walked away, I saw something that made my heart race, my son's car parked nearby. I was desperate to know what had happened, to understand why this was happening to me. I made my way toward the car, but just as I reached out to touch the door, a voice called from behind me. "Mom, we need to talk." I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. There he was, my son, standing in front of me like he hadn't just thrown me out of his house hours ago. His face was serious, but there was something else in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. "Why did you do this to me?" I asked, my voice shaky. I had to know the truth. I didn't want to, but, Mom, there's something you need to know. I didn't have a choice. I stared at him, confused. "What do you mean you didn't have a choice?" He looked away, his gaze dropping to the ground. It's because of the money, Mom. You don't understand. It's all connected." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "What money? What are you talking about?" He took a deep breath before looking back at me. "You need to come with me. I'll explain everything." I followed him, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Why had he done this to me? What was going on with the money? And what did he mean by it being all connected? We walked in silence until we reached a small cafe down the street. My son opened the door and gestured for me to sit. As I sat down, I noticed something strange. The same banker from earlier was sitting at the table, looking just as shocked as I was. "What's going on here?" I asked, my voice trembling with both fear and confusion. "There's something you need to know. Something you're not going to like," the banker said, his voice barely above a whisper. I stared at him, my heart racing. The tension in the room was thick, and I felt the weight of his words pressing down on me. My son looked at the banker, then back at me. His expression was grim, like he knew what was coming, but he wasn't ready to tell me. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The banker took a deep breath. "The account your husband left behind, it's not just marked for fraudulent activity. It's been frozen, but not by the bank." I leaned forward, my mind racing. "What do you mean? Who froze it?" "That's the part you're not going to like," the banker continued. "It was your son." I stared at my son, my mouth going dry. "What?" "I didn't have a choice," he said quietly, looking away from me. There was no other way. I could feel my world crashing down around me. Why would my son do this? What had driven him to freeze his own mother's access to money? "You need to understand, Mom," he said, his voice cracking. "It was for your own good. For my own good." How could this possibly be for my own good? I was desperate to know the truth, but before I could ask another question, the banker leaned in and whispered something that made my blood run cold. "Your husband didn't just leave you a debt," the banker said. "He left you a secret. A secret you'll never be able to escape." My mind raced, and before I could respond, my son stood up suddenly. "Mom, we need to go. Now." I didn't have time to ask any more questions as my son grabbed my hand and pulled me out of the cafe. My head was spinning. The revelation that my son had frozen the account was overwhelming, but the banker's words kept echoing in my mind, a secret you'll never be able to escape. We walked in silence, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being pulled deeper into something I couldn't control. My son didn't say a word as we made our way through the crowded streets. The holiday lights above seemed to mock me, a reminder of everything I had lost. "Where are we going?" I finally asked, my voice breaking through the silence. "To the one place we can figure this out," he said, glancing at me with a look of regret. We stopped in front of a building I didn't recognize. My son led me inside, and we took the elevator to the top floor. The door opened to reveal a large office. My son stepped inside, motioning for me to follow. The moment I walked in, I was hit with the smell of old leather and paper, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to uncover something that would change everything. But just as I was about to speak, the door slammed shut behind me. A man in a dark suit stood at the desk, his eyes cold and calculating. "You shouldn't have come here," the man in the suit said, his voice sending a chill through my bones. I looked at my son, hoping for some explanation, but he avoided my gaze. My stomach dropped as I realized we had walked into something far more dangerous than I had imagined. The man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "Your husband was involved in something much bigger than you think. And now, so are you." I was frozen in place, unable to speak. My mind was racing, trying to piece together everything that had happened. What had my husband been involved in? And why was my son bringing me into this now? "Mom, I didn't want you to get caught up in this," my son said quietly. "But now, there's no turning back." The man smiled, a cold, unsettling grin. "You've already crossed the line. Now, we just need to see if you're ready for what comes next." I felt a sudden panic rise in my chest. What had I gotten myself into? And was there any way out of this? Before I could ask another question, the man turned to the side and nodded to someone else in the room. The door behind me opened, and I turned to see a group of men step inside. One of them was holding a folder, and as he stepped forward, my heart stopped. "What's in the folder?" I asked, my voice shaking. The man with the folder stepped forward, and my heart pounded in my chest. The moment he spoke, everything in the room seemed to go still. The silence was deafening. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure, but every nerve in my body screamed that something terrible was about to unfold. The man handed the folder to the one who had been standing at the desk, and my son stood there, his hands trembling slightly. I looked at him, searching for any sign of reassurance, but he avoided my gaze once again, his expression filled with guilt. The man at the desk opened the folder and spread out the papers inside. I couldn't make out the words, but the looks on their faces told me everything I needed to know. This was no ordinary situation. "This is your husband's legacy," the man in the suit continued, his voice cold and calculated. "He wasn't just a simple man. He was involved in things you don't understand, and now, those things are your responsibility." I was stunned. My husband had been a quiet, private man. He had always taken care of everything, but he never spoke about his work or his past. How could this be? What had he been hiding? And why was I being dragged into it now? The debts, the frozen accounts, the fraud. The man paused, his eyes narrowing. "It's all part of a much bigger picture. A picture you're now part of, whether you like it or not." I was in shock. Everything I thought I knew about my husband was crumbling before my eyes. Was he really involved in something this dark? And if so, why had he kept it from me? Why had he left me in the dark? I turned to my son, desperate for answers. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you keep this from me?" He lowered his head, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want to drag you into it, Mom. I thought I could handle it on my own. But now it's too late." I felt the walls of the room closing in on me. The man in the suit looked at me with cold, unblinking eyes. "You've already made the first mistake, coming here. Now, there's no going back." My mind raced. What did he mean by that? What was the first mistake? And what did he want from me? I had no answers, only more questions. Then, the man at the desk stood up and walked toward me. He looked at me like he was studying me, calculating every move I made. "There's one thing we need from you," he said softly, his tone now unnervingly calm. "You're going to have to make a choice, and it's going to change everything." I felt a lump form in my throat. I had no idea what he was talking about, but I could sense that whatever choice was coming, it would be the most difficult decision of my life. Before I could respond, my son stepped forward, his eyes wide with fear. "Mom, don't do it. Please, don't make that choice." But before I could understand what he was saying, the lights flickered once again, and the room was plunged into darkness. Then, the unmistakable sound of a door slamming shut echoed through the room. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The air felt thick, like it was pressing against me, suffocating me. And then, a voice, familiar, but cold, came from the shadows. "You've reached the point of no return." The room was silent for a long moment, but the tension was unbearable. What was going to happen next? I couldn't even begin to guess. The voice in the darkness sent a chill through my spine. "You've reached the point of no return." The words echoed in my mind, reverberating through the cold, silent room. My pulse quickened as the darkness seemed to press closer, making it hard to breathe. Who was in the shadows? And what did they mean by no return? I could barely make out the shape of my son standing next to me, his hand gripping mine with a force I hadn't felt in years. His fingers were trembling, but there was something else, something urgent, almost desperate, in the way he held me. "Mom, we have to get out of here, now," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. But before I could respond, the lights flickered back on, bright and blinding, and the man who had been at the desk earlier stepped forward again. His face was hard, like stone, and his eyes bore into me with a chilling intensity. "You've been given a choice," he said coldly. "Now, it's time to make it." I looked around the room, the oppressive silence hanging heavily in the air. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing with questions. What was this choice? What did they want from me? Why was my son so afraid? "Mom," he whispered again, "don't do it. We can still walk away from this." I turned to face him, his words filling me with confusion and dread. Walk away. How could I walk away when I didn't even understand what was happening? I had been dragged into a web of secrets and lies, and now, it seemed like the only way out was to make a decision that could change everything. The man in the suit was still standing there, waiting for me to speak, his gaze unwavering. "The choice is simple. Join us, and the consequences of your husband's past will be wiped clean. No more debt, no more fraud, no more secrets. You'll be free." A wave of disbelief washed over me. Join them? How could I even consider such a thing? What was their real motive? And if I refused, what would happen? I looked at my son, his face pale and strained. He shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, Mom, you don't know what they're offering. They're not giving you a way out, they're just trapping you further." The man at the desk smiled, his teeth sharp and predatory. "Your son doesn't understand, madam. He's been blind to the truth for too long. The real question is whether you want to stay trapped in a life of lies and debt, or whether you want to take control of your future. All you have to do is say yes." I felt the weight of his words settle in my chest. I knew what this decision meant, even if I didn't fully understand everything behind it. I was standing at a crossroads, and whatever I chose would determine the rest of my life. I swallowed hard, the decision feeling heavier than anything I had ever faced. My son was shaking his head, his eyes pleading with me to choose differently. But I wasn't sure if I could. My hands were clammy, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Before I could open my mouth to speak, the man in the suit held up a hand, silencing me. "You don't need to answer right away. Take your time, but remember, every moment you delay makes it harder to walk away." The tension in the room was unbearable, and my heart was racing. What should I do? Could I trust them? Could I trust my son? I had been betrayed, lied to, and thrown out into the cold, but now I was being given an opportunity to make it all go away. But was it worth the price? Then, just as I was about to speak, the door behind me creaked open. A figure stepped inside, their silhouette casting a long shadow across the room. The man in the suit turned toward the newcomer, his face tightening with an emotion I couldn't read. And then, the figure spoke. "We need to move quickly. They're onto us." The room froze. What was going on? Who was this new person? And why did it feel like the danger was only just beginning? My son's grip on my hand tightened, and his voice was barely a whisper. "We don't have much time. Whatever happens next, you have to stay close to me." The lights flickered once more, and I could feel the weight of the decision crushing me. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, and I immediately felt the change in the air. The tension, already unbearable, thickened, and the room seemed to constrict around me. My son's hand tightened around mine, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to move quickly. They're onto us," the newcomer said. His voice low but urgent. I turned to face him, but before I could speak, the man in the suit interrupted, his voice sharp and commanding. "What do you mean, onto us?" The newcomer, a tall man with a rugged face and wild, unkempt hair, didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to my son, his gaze hard. "You shouldn't have brought her here," he said. "They're already watching. We have no time left." I felt a cold sweat break out across my back. Who was this man? What was he talking about? And who exactly was they? Before I could ask another question, the man in the suit turned to the door, his hand hovering near his pocket, like he was waiting for something. "You're right," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of irritation. "They're already aware." My son jerked my arm, pulling me toward the back of the room. "We need to go. Now." I stumbled, trying to keep up with his frantic pace. The man in the suit was right behind us, and I could hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway beyond. The newcomer followed close behind, his eyes scanning the surroundings like he was expecting something, or someone, to jump out at us at any moment. As we reached the door, I could hear voices, muffled but growing louder. My heart raced. Who were these people? And what was I walking into? Suddenly, the door swung open, and my son pulled me out into a narrow hallway. The man in the suit was just behind us, followed closely by the rugged stranger. We made our way down the corridor, my mind whirling with questions I couldn't answer. We reached an elevator at the end of the hall. My son pressed the button frantically, glancing over his shoulder, but the elevator doors didn't open right away. I could hear the footsteps behind us growing closer, and the tension in my chest tightened. "Mom, listen to me," my son said, his voice shaking. "We have to go. Whatever happens, don't trust anyone. I'll explain everything later, I promise." The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and we piled inside. My son pressed the ground floor button, and I felt the familiar sensation of the elevator descending. But as we began to move, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the elevator shaft. Someone was coming after us. "Stay calm," the newcomer said quietly, his hand hovering near the emergency stop button. "We can still get out of here. Just stay calm." But just as he spoke, the elevator jerked to a sudden halt. My stomach lurched, and I heard a sharp intake of breath from my son. The lights flickered, and the elevator descended no further. "No," my son shouted. "We have to get out. Now." I felt a rising panic in my chest, but before I could respond, the lights went out entirely, leaving us in pitch blackness. The air felt suffocating, and the world outside the elevator suddenly felt miles away. The only sound was the frantic pounding of my son's fists against the door. But just as his desperation reached its peak, a voice came from the darkness. "Don't bother. You're not going anywhere." I turned toward the voice, my heart in my throat. The voice was familiar, but cold, and it sent chills down my spine. It was the man from the shadows, the one who had spoken to me before. The one who had made me a choice. "I've been waiting for this moment," he said, his tone smooth and calculated. "You've reached the end of the line." I took a shaky breath, my mind racing. This was it. I had been given the choice, and now the consequences were unfolding before me. My son was beside me, and the man in the suit was still lurking in the darkness, his eyes watching us. "You can't escape this," the man said softly, his words sinking in like a weight on my chest. And then, the elevator doors slid open with a sharp, metallic sound. On the other side stood the same group of men who had been in the room earlier, their eyes cold and unreadable. The door was open, but I didn't feel like I could move. The weight of the choice I had made, the weight of everything, crushed me. "This is it," the man in the suit said, stepping forward. "You've made your decision." I looked at my son, my heart breaking as the realization hit me. This was the point of no return. But before I could speak, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. The door behind us slammed shut, and the last thing I heard was my son's voice, barely above a whisper. "Run, Mom. Run now." And then, the world went dark. The sirens were growing louder, their wail cutting through the tension in the air. My heart was pounding in my chest as I turned to my son, his face pale with fear. His grip on my arm tightened, pulling me toward the back of the elevator. There was no time left. We had to escape. But the door had slammed shut with a force I hadn't expected. The dark hallway outside was now a blur of chaos, with shadows moving swiftly toward us. I could hear footsteps and voices closing in, the pressure mounting with every passing second. "Mom, we have to go now. They're coming." My son's voice trembled, desperation creeping in. He reached for the emergency stop button once again, but before he could press it, the elevator jerked into motion. The lights flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. I couldn't tell if we were going up or down, but the speed at which we were moving felt wrong, too fast, too sudden. My thoughts were spinning, the weight of the situation bearing down on me. What had we gotten ourselves into? Who were these people chasing us, and what did they want? Suddenly, the elevator stopped, and the door opened to a scene I hadn't expected to see. The dimly lit hallway beyond was filled with men, their eyes locked on us. The same group that had been in the room earlier. One of them stepped forward, his face unreadable. "You've made a terrible mistake, coming this far." I recoiled, but my son didn't hesitate. He shoved me behind him, his eyes wild with panic. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he growled. "We'll never let you get away with this." But the man in front of us simply smiled, his expression almost amused. "It's too late for threats. There's no way out now. You've been marked. And no one can save you." The world around me seemed to close in, the walls pressing in on all sides. I glanced at my son, whose face had turned ashen. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. But before we could even think about running, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind us, quick, calculated, like someone had been waiting for us. I turned, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw the man in the suit. "You really thought you could outrun this, didn't you?" he asked softly, his voice almost mocking. "You were never going to escape. Not now, not ever." I took a shaky breath, trying to stay calm, but everything was slipping away. The world felt like it was spiraling out of control, and I had no idea what to do or who to trust. And then, it happened. A loud bang echoed through the hallway, followed by a burst of blinding light. I screamed, covering my eyes, as the entire building seemed to shake around us. The lights flickered wildly, and I could hear chaos erupting behind us. "Run!" my son shouted, his voice hoarse. He grabbed my arm and yanked me away from the men, pushing us toward the back of the hallway. I didn't know where we were going, but I didn't care. We had to escape. I looked behind me one last time to see the group of men standing in the chaos, frozen in place. The man in the suit seemed unfazed, his eyes locked on us. He didn't move, just watched as we ran. We burst through a door at the end of the hallway, and for a moment, it felt like we had escaped. The air outside was cold and sharp, the city lights casting long shadows on the ground. We were outside, free, at least for now. But as I turned to look at my son, something in the distance caught my eye. A black car, parked on the street, its engine running. The same car I had seen before. They were still following us. I grabbed my son's hand, pulling him forward, but just as we reached the corner, I heard a voice behind me. "Don't bother running. You're not going anywhere." I stopped in my tracks. The voice was familiar, too familiar. Turning slowly, I found myself face to face with the one person I never expected to see. It was my husband, but he wasn't the man I had known. His eyes were cold, distant, and empty. We have unfinished business, he said, his voice flat and emotionless. And just like that, everything I thought I knew about my family, about my life, shattered into pieces. The past, the present, and the future all collided in that moment, leaving me with one terrifying question. Was I really ever free? And with that, the world around me faded to black. The air around me grew heavy as I stood frozen, staring at my husband, my dead husband, standing before me. My son had already backed away, his face pale with fear. His body trembled, but I could see the confusion and hurt in his eyes. How could this be happening? How could he be here? I couldn't breathe. It was as if time itself had stopped, and the world around me had ceased to exist. The only thing that mattered in that moment was my husband, alive, standing before me, and looking at me with those cold, lifeless eyes. What is going on? My voice was barely above a whisper, my throat tight, my heart racing with 100 different questions. My husband, the man I thought I had lost forever, looked at me with no trace of warmth, no sign of recognition. His gaze was distant, like he was seeing a stranger in front of him. We have unfinished business, he repeated, his voice devoid of any emotion. It's time for you to understand the truth. I took a shaky step back, my mind reeling. The truth? What truth? I thought you were dead. Dead, he interrupted, his eyes narrowing. No, I was never dead, and you were never meant to know what happened. I felt a knot form in my stomach. My son was looking at me, but I couldn't read his expression anymore. The shock was too much. I turned to him, desperate for some kind of explanation. What is going on? Tell me, please. I don't understand. I begged, but my son didn't speak. His lips trembled, his eyes full of pain and confusion. He was as lost in this moment as I was. The man in the suit stepped forward, his cold voice slicing through the tension. Your husband was part of something much bigger than you could ever imagine, and now, so are you. I could feel the weight of his words settle on me, suffocating me. I turned back to my husband, my heart beating faster, my mind struggling to process what was happening. I don't understand, I whispered, my eyes welling up with tears. Why did you leave me in the dark? Why did you let me believe you were gone? He didn't answer at first, just stared at me with a chilling detachment. Finally, he spoke. Because you were never supposed to know. It was for your own safety. But now, there's no choice. The past has caught up with us. My head spun. I felt like the ground beneath me was collapsing, and I was falling into a dark abyss. Everything I had known, everything I had believed, was unraveling before my eyes. You lied to me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You lied about everything. I didn't lie. I protected you, he replied, his voice cold, emotionless. But now, the truth has caught up with us, and there's nothing left to protect. The world around me seemed to fall away, the voices growing distant as the reality of the situation settled in. My husband was not the man I thought he was. He had been part of something dark, something dangerous, and now I was caught in the middle of it all. And just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the door to the alleyway slammed open. A group of men, dressed in black, faces hidden in shadows, rushed in, surrounding us. My son stepped in front of me, his body shaking but his stance firm. No, he said, his voice trembling with fear. We won't be part of this anymore. We're done. The man in the suit smiled, a cruel, predatory smile. You have no choice. You're already too deep. I felt my son's grip tighten on my arm, and I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear that I had been feeling for so long. But then, something in me clicked. I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't let this darkness consume us. We'll fight, I whispered, my voice steady despite the chaos around me. We'll fight until the end. My son looked at me, his eyes wide, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope in his expression. Maybe, just maybe, we could find a way out of this. But as I looked around, the men closed in on us. There was no escape. The walls were closing in. And then, everything went black. The last thing I heard was the sound of my husband's voice, distant and cold. It's too late. You can't outrun the past. And with that, everything was over. The past had caught up with us, and there was no turning back.